Today we're in the midst of a series of sermons based on the life and story of Simon Peter. He was an ordinary fisherman who lived with Jesus during that time. He became one of his followers. He was faithful, and yet he was flawed. Outside of Jesus, Peter is the main character in the Gospels, the lead character in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus is the focus, of course, and yet we also come to understand more about who Jesus is when we hear the stories of Peter and how Peter and Jesus interact with one another. We see in Peter a picture of the Christian life, an image for us to follow or to do not what he does at times. He makes mistakes, yet he's striving to get it right. He wants to do the right thing and oftentimes starts doing it, but then in many stories he messes up. There's some place where he gets it wrong. And in the series, we're taking an in-depth dive into his story, into the faith and the character of Simon Peter to see how we can learn for our own lives how to be more faithful and to live as followers of Jesus. This series and the sermon today are based on the book and the sermon series by Adam Hamilton. And I want to remind you that 3 weeks ago, we began our series on Simon Peter by remembering that he was just an ordinary person. He was a fisherman. He worked on the Sea of Galilee, and he responded to Jesus' invitation to him to come and fish for people. Jesus borrows his boat. He asked Peter to borrow his stuff, and Jesus asks us that Jesus might use our stuff to accomplish God's work in the world. The Holy Spirit enables us to be part of God's work. Last week, we took a closer look at the time when Simon Peter got it right. He answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," when Jesus asked the question, "Who do you say that I am?" And that same question Jesus still asks us today. Who do you say that Jesus is? Jesus invited his disciples and invites us to say no to ourselves, to take up our cross, and to follow him. Today we turn to the Last Supper. On that night, Jesus shares his final meal with his disciples before he would be put to death on the cross. The disciples don't know that it's the Last Supper, but Jesus does. It is the Passover Seder. Following the meal, Jesus will be arrested and taken for his trial, and this part of the story is crucial to the story of Peter's life. And I want to remind you a little bit about what happens at that supper. In each of the Gospels, there's a little bit different account. We see different parts of the story. And when you read the Gospel according to John, you find the story of the washing of the feet. And I want to remind you that in the first century, people walked around a lot. They wore sandals or open-toed shoes. The streets were dirt and dusty. You walked everywhere. You didn't ride. There were no cars. You couldn't call an Uber. There was no Lyft. You walked. And by the time you got to the end of the day, your feet were tired. They were sore. They were dusty, dirty, and maybe even a little smelly. Whenever you entered a house, you always took off your shoes. And before you started walking barefoot in someone else's home, you washed your feet. That was just part of the normal routine. Cleansing your feet was refreshing, especially if you'd been traveling for a long distance that day. You felt clean because your feet were clean. Also, you didn't smell up the place because your feet, when you took your shoes off, they would be cleaned a little bit. You'd find a basin, a pitcher of water, and a towel right there by the door when you arrived to someone's home to allow this to happen. Now, if you were going into someone's home where there were servants, it was the lowest of the household servants whose job it was to wash your feet, to wash the feet of the guests. And today in this story, there were no household servants when Jesus and his disciples walk into the upper room to share this meal together. There's simply a basin and a pitcher and a towel. And I just picture them sitting there by the door and the disciples coming in. And the first disciple sees the basin and just walks by and goes on to the table where it would sit down to eat. The second disciple walks in, sees the bowl and the pitcher, and turns it and walks on to the table. This pattern continues until all 12 of the disciples have walked by the basin and not washed their feet. Now, why is that? Did they not have good manners? What was the problem here? Why aren't they stopping to wash their feet? Didn't they want to be refreshed? And a colleague shared a reflection on this question. They said, it could have been that the first disciple thought, I don't see any servants here. And if I stop to wash my feet, knowing Jesus, he's going to expect me to clean everyone else's feet too. I'm not signing up for that today. I'm not sure about that other guy's feet. I might be able to handle my own, but this whole idea of serving other people that Jesus has talked about, I'm not sure I'm in for that today. Now, of course, we don't know for sure what happened, but what we do know is that by the time the disciples get to the table, no one has washed their feet. And so they're there at the table, they're preparing the meal, it's about to begin, and then Jesus gets up and does something that mortifies them. He goes to the door, he picks up the basin and the pitcher and the towel, and he comes to the table, and Jesus starts to wash their feet. He goes to the first disciple, takes a knee, places the feet in the pan, pours the water over, takes the towel, wipes them dry, goes on to the next one. Now, how do you think that disciple felt when Jesus washed his feet? Do you think he was embarrassed? Do you think he wished he just stopped and washed the other disciples' feet? I mean, Jesus is their king. They'd left everything to follow after him. They had hopes and dreams. They'd been teaching about God's kingdom, and they were following after him. And here the king is washing their feet. Do they speak up? No, they don't say anything. They're just dumbfounded. Maybe they didn't know what to say. So Jesus washes one disciple's feet, and he washes another, and washes another. And there's only one disciple who speaks up. And who do you think that is, of course, but Simon Peter? And this is what Simon says in John 13:8. "No," Peter said, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus replied, "Unless I wash you, you won't have a place with me." Now, doesn't that sound like Simon? You'll never wash my feet. Now, he's not like being mad at Jesus. He's just saying, Lord, this isn't right. This isn't how things should go. You shouldn't be the one washing feet. Maybe myself or the servants. You're my king, Jesus. This is not right. I don't want this to happen. But Jesus says, unless I wash you, you won't have a place with me. Jesus is saying to Simon Peter, unless you let me do this, you don't get it. You need to let me serve you. I'm going to do this. I'm going to teach you something through this. And the story continues in verse 12. After he washed the disciples' feet, he put on his robes and returned to his place at the table. Jesus said to them, "Do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you speak correctly because I am. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you too must wash each other's feet. I have given you an example. Just as I have done, you also must do." Now, I'm pretty sure from this time forward, the disciples would never enter a room again without remembering that story and stopping to wash each other's feet. Maybe even rushing over to the bowl to make sure that they were the ones that got to serve, that got to do what Jesus taught them to do. And yet, I believe that this has something to do with much more than just washing feet. Jesus was teaching them what it means to be one of his followers. Jesus was teaching us what it means to be one of his followers. To be a follower of Jesus is to think less of yourself and more of other people. It means looking around to see the needs of those that surround you and not waiting for other people to meet their needs. It's not to be the one who gets to control and to rule over everyone. It means being the one who seeks to serve, who serves every time. Jesus goes on to say that just more clearly in Matthew chapter 20, 25, and 26. But Jesus called them over and said, "You know that those who rule the Gentiles show off their authority over them, and their high-ranking officials order them around, but that's not the way it will be with you. Whoever wants to be great among you will be your servant." Whoever wants to be great among you will be your servant. So I want to ask you this question. How are you doing at serving? What does service look like in your life? Serving other people and not putting yourself first. In business, in relationships, among our family, serving is critical. When we seek to serve other people, it begins to transform the way that we live in relationship with others. What does servant leadership look like for you? Jesus' invitation for you and I today. At the end of July, I was coming back from a continuing education event in Texas, and I was flying Southwest because you could usually get a pretty good deal on a ticket. And And how it works on Southwest, you get a boarding pass and a boarding group and a number, and then when you get on the plane, it's open seating. Maybe you have had this experience. You choose the first available seat, and it's yours. Now, a small splurge when I travel is that I allow myself to get the early bird check-in. You pay a little bit more, and then they check you in automatically. So then you have to be at your computer precisely 24 hours before the boarding time to try to get the A group. I don't know if anyone else struggles with this. I do. I let myself do that most of the time. Except this time, I had that, and still, I don't know whether there were a lot of travelers or other frequent flyers. I was in the B group, at the end of the B group, and despite the early bird check-in, I thought, are you serious? Come on, what went wrong here? Why me? When it showed up on my phone, this little thundercloud up over my head, you know, like it does in the cartoons. And I like to sit as close to the front as I'm able to, and I love the aisle seat. The aisle seat is really what's most important. I want to be able to stretch my legs out. And well, this was a full flight. And so someone is sitting in the aisle and the window, most of the rows, and I think, I'm not sitting in the middle. I am going to find an aisle seat. And so I get back to the end, and I find one. 3 rows from the very back of the plane, I get my aisle seat. The plane continues to fill up, and I'm like, well, I'm at the back of the plane, but at least I've got my aisle, and that's okay. And then the flight attendant comes back towards the end of the plane and asks, the attendant says, would someone be willing to give up their seat and take a middle seat so that a couple could sit together? And I think to myself, are you kidding me? You want me to move so a couple can sit together? No way, I'm not moving. Nobody moves. And then the couple who's right behind the attendant says, her husband says, this is her first flight. And she's terrified. I think, listen, it's not my fault that you got in the C group. I am good with the aisle. And then I look up and I look in her eyes. And I can see that things are not going well for her. She is terrified. And I hesitate again, and I think, really? But then I said, I'll do it. So I moved to the very back row in the middle seat so this couple can sit together. Now here's the deal. Why did I care so much about the aisle seat? I mean, if they wanted the aisle seat so that they could sit together after the first time of asking, why didn't I say, hey, no problem, first time? But at that moment, I forgot what it means to serve others. I forgot what it means to put others before myself. So I wonder, for you, how are you doing at being a servant? How are you doing at putting other people before yourself? Your spouse, your employees, your customers, because that's the rhythm of the Christian life. I think this is what Jesus is teaching us when he shares with his disciples in that way, to put others first, to interact with the world through a lens of service. All right, so let's go on to what happens next at the dinner. Jesus is sitting at the table with his disciples, and at one point he says, tonight, one of you will betray me. And they're all aghast. Can you imagine? They can't believe that Jesus would say this. How is it possible that one of them could betray him? They've been following him for years. Here they are in Jerusalem, ready for things to happen. But of course, Judas Iscariot, we know, has already planned on selling Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. And Jesus goes on to say, and the rest of you will desert me. Now, about this time, Judas says to Jesus, Jesus, what are you talking about? Are you talking about me? And Jesus says, what you're going to do, go and do it. And Judas leaves. And the other 11, they don't really hear about this interaction. They don't quite understand. They didn't hear what Jesus said exactly to Judas. And they say, Lord, no, deserting you is impossible for us. It's not going to happen. And Simon Peter is the one who really speaks up there in verse 33. Peter replied, if everyone else stumbles because of you, I'll never stumble. Jesus said to him, I assure you that before the rooster crows tonight, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said, even if I must die alongside you, I won't deny you. And all the disciples said the same thing. Now, do you think Simon Peter really meant what he said that night? I think he did. I think he really meant it in that moment. He meant, Jesus, I want to follow you. I'm yours. I've modeled my life after you, and I want to do your will. I will not deny you, he says to Jesus. Following the meal, they go to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. And it's there that Jesus is arrested and taken before the council at the high priest's house. Jesus leads a crowd there. Jesus is betrayed with a kiss, and the rabble-rousers bring Jesus to the high priest's house for trial. And this is the time when Peter follows through on what Jesus predicts. When Jesus says, you will deny me, this is where it happens. And I want to invite you to just read the scriptures with me, to read in Peter's voice. And so here's how it's going to work. You'll see the words on the screen in just a moment, and when you see the words in all caps, that's Peter. And so I invite you to say those words with me as we read through this story. I think we've got them. Do we have those? Verse 69? All right. So I'll read it. When it's in all caps, that's Peter. You say these words with me. Meanwhile, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant woman came and said to him, "You were also with Jesus, the Galilean." But he denied it in front of all of them, saying, "I don't know what you're talking about." When he went over to the gate, another woman saw him and said to those who were there, "This man was with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." With a solemn pledge, he denied it again, saying, "I don't know the man." A short time later, those standing there came and said to Peter, "You must be one of them. The way you talk gives you away." And then he cursed and swore, "I don't know the man." At that very moment, the rooster crowed. Peter remembered Jesus' words, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and cried uncontrollably. What's Peter feeling at this moment? Humiliation, failure, betrayal. He's betrayed his Lord. He's not only deserted him, but he also denied even knowing him. And here's what I think we're supposed to gain from this text. One of the things is that we're supposed to recognize is that we've all been Simon Peter somewhere along the way. We might not be threatened with death if we admitted that we knew Jesus. We may not be in the position of saying with our lips, "No, I don't know Jesus," at least not with our speech, but all of us do deny Jesus at times by our actions or our inactions, by what we say or by what we don't say, by what we do or by what we don't do. In my life, every single week, every day, there's sometime when I think something that's not fitting for a follower of Jesus, for a Christian, say something I shouldn't have said, or do something I shouldn't have done, or failed to do what I should have done. And every week when we pray, we make time for silence to be able to confess and bring those before God. And I confess every day. And yet I know when I come here to this place that I need to confess again. And that's why we have that time, to make space, to recognize we've messed up, to pray for forgiveness and to say, "Lord, I'm sorry once again that I've denied you by my actions or my words, by my thoughts." And I wonder, how have you denied Jesus? And do you ever wonder why this story is even in the Bible? I mean, why do the 4 Gospels tell this story? Peter is one of the great heroes of the early church. The Gospel writers put these stories to paper around 70 to 95 AD, not long after Simon Peter's death. And they all include this story. It's seldom that they all 4 include the same story, but all 4 tell the story of Peter denying Jesus 3 times. So the question is, why? Why would they reveal this most embarrassing moment in Peter's life? Why would they share what is perhaps Peter's greatest failure as a disciple, especially if he is one of the great heroes of the early church? And the only answer that scholars have been able to offer us is that Simon Peter himself must have told this story. When Simon Peter preached, he must have shared this story over and over and over again. And the only way that they'd put this story in there is if it became so associated with Peter that you couldn't tell Peter's story without telling the story, because Peter offered it on himself over and over again. So why would Peter tell his story of denying Jesus? Why would he preach in churches and come to people and say, "Hey, let me tell you about the night that they arrested Jesus. I was there. I saw him in there on trial, and I was so afraid." And they said, "You surely were one of them." And I said, No, I don't even know the man. I cursed and denied him." How would he tell that story? It could have been a way to say that if you fail, and deny Jesus, there's hope for you too. The good news is that there is hope for you and for me. What we may have done to deny Jesus is not the end of the story. Simon Peter didn't go around telling people about his greatness. He shared stories about falling into the water when he should have been walking on it. He talked about not wanting to go fishing with Jesus. He said, look at how I denied Jesus and what he's doing. Peter is telling us all these stories to say, if I did it, it's going to be okay if you've done it too. What you did in denying Jesus doesn't have to be the end of your story. Your worst moment does not have to define your life. It doesn't define your life. The most embarrassing or humiliating failure that you've ever had can be redeemed, can be made new. So offer it to God and begin again. Do you recognize that you've denied Jesus somewhere along the way? Are you asking for God's grace and mercy? Do you know that whatever you've done in the past doesn't disqualify you from what God can do through you in the future? Simon Peter, the rock, becomes the church's foundation. And perhaps for us too, there's a place to be able to tell those stories with some distance between it about the times we failed. And in telling these stories, maybe encourage others and help others find hope. We are called to be servant leaders. We are likely to deny Jesus from time to time. But Christ is the Lord of the second chance, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth chance. And God can use our shortcomings, our failures, and our embarrassing moments for God's glory if we open ourselves to God. And that's the story from Simon Peter for today. Will you pray with me? God, please make me a servant. Help me to serve you and your people. Lord, please forgive me. Help me start afresh and anew. Make us yours. Use us as your servants. We pray in your holy name. Amen.